Okay. So I am in a very unusual situation today, but I'm happy. I am in this unusual situation today. My name is Marina Balina. I am Isaac Funk Professor Emerita from Illinois Wesleyan University. So even the location is different than yours. I was the first speaker in the series, and I am replacing Professor Sheila Yellen today. So who is in Zoom?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
wonderful.
Yes.
So then she could see me. It is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker. Raymond Deluca is an assistant professor of Russian studies at the University of Kentucky. He received his PhD from Harvard University in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and a secondary field certification in art, film, and visual studies. His research interests include film theory, animal studies, queer cinema, and post-humanism. He has published in such academic outlets as Slavic and Eastern European Journal, Canadian Journal of Film Studies, Film Critics, and Kinokultura, which my very good friend is editing. Birgit Weimars, right. So my acquaintance with Raymond happened when he introduced an absolutely magnificent series of Andrei Tarkovsky. And thanks to him, we enjoyed 5 films? Six, yeah.
Nostalgia.
In
2 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh.
That was the one that we couldn't do.
Yeah,
2 weeks,
okay.
So.
I will be in France.
Well.
If I want something, then I don't get it. Sorry, but anyway, that was absolutely magnificent series of film introductions with wonderful discussions after that. Those of you who visited, who attended those series, I mean, they definitely enjoyed it very, very much. It is my great pleasure to introduce you, and the floor is yours. So go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Could you actually hit this light? Maybe it's right by the trash can. The light switches, so the screen will be a little more illuminated. There's a couple. That one, yeah.
Yeah.
This works for me. Is it too dark?
I think it's good, but can you also minimize the?
Oh yeah, this. Like that.
I don't think we need to see all 3 of them.
Here, yeah. Like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for the introduction. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. It's particularly nice to see so many students too. So I'm going to dive into this talk. It's about 45 minutes long. It's about all sorts of different things. It takes a lot of twists and turns, but I hope you all enjoy and learn a bunch about a lot of different topics. So I'll just dive in. So as I've watched the previous 4 speakers in this lecture series on Jewish Ukraine and learned about the politics and histories and trauma and beautifully weird world of Jewish Ukraine, I've been struck by 2 things. The first, and this is at the risk of sounding somewhat self-effacing, is that I have an utter lack of authority to be speaking on the subject. I'm neither Jewish nor Ukrainian, and my research in Slavic studies only glancingly touches on Ukraine. Like many Americans, I, in fact, embarrassingly, was surprised to learn just how big Ukraine was, in fact, when the war broke out and maps like this started flooding social media. So that's how much I don't, in fact, know about Ukraine. So consider this a kind of disclaimer. I want to make sure everybody knows this is not my area of specialty, and I'm looking forward to the conversation afterward. But the second thing that has struck me about these lectures on Jewish Ukraine is the biographical and almost diaristic notes that they've all began with and sustained. And so most of the previous speakers illustrated their arguments by situating their own personal histories into the cultural trajectory of Eastern European Jewishness, particularly that region's experience of trauma, as represented here by some photos, commemorative photos, and Soviet soldiers covering up the remains of the Babin Yar massacres, which was one of the darkest moments for Eastern European Jews in the Second World War. And so each of the previous speakers deftly combined the personal and the political that made for very intimate erudition about this part of the world. I do not have a biographical connection to Ukraine. I am a third-generation American citizen of Polish and Italian Catholic descent. And so listening to these more personal reflections on Ukraine, I thought maybe I might try to do something similar, but also different. How might my own cultural and political distance from the subject matter get us to Jewish Ukraine all the same? So I hope people will humor this talk, because much of it does not have to do with Jewish Ukraine in an immediate sense. But I think it sets up the cultural and philosophical and geopolitical backdrop by which contemporary Jewish Ukraine has taken shape. So to begin, I was born on June 17th, 1991. And this was exactly 5 days after Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the clunkily titled Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and thereby defeating 57% of the vote, Mikhail Gorbachev's preferred candidate. And following this largely symbolic election, Yeltsin declared Russia to be an autonomous political entity from the Soviet Union. And this was a bold declaration, if there ever was one. And then a few months later, while I was still an infant in a leafy suburban residence in New Jersey, Gorbachev was infamously arrested and imprisoned while on holiday in Crimea. And this event is known as the August coup by communist hardliners in a last-ditch attempt to preserve the disintegrating USSR. And in response, thousands of protesters flooded Moscow city streets, and Yeltsin climbed atop a tank and began making thunderous speeches to rally the opposition. And for all this event's theatrics, this was not political theater. Bloodshed was a very real possibility during this moment. And the coup unraveled after only 3 days, and Gorbachev was reinstated, and he kicked into motion, and the coup's failure kicked into motion the dissolution of communism. And so between the arrest and Yeltsin's speeches, this moment, in fact, revealed that by 1990, communism had become a counter-revolutionary force in the history of politics and ideas. And the real revolutionary dynamism, the means by which politics and civic society might be reimagined, radiated, of all places, from the capitalist West, particularly America, of the very world that Soviet communists had characterized as a deadened, regressive place, ill-disposed to human thriving. Democratic elections, freedom of speech, open markets, accountability, meritocracy, those were the real values of 1989 and 1991. And I think they're perfectly symbolized by blue jeans, Levi's on the Berlin Wall, and Gorbachev in Pizza Hut. And so the same set of values, ironically, that were in vogue at the turn of the 19th century in the wake of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, classically Republican values of competition, reason, enterprise, self-determination, those were again fashionable. And the past had become the present. The fiery revolutionary spirit of communism had counterintuitively shifted onto bourgeois liberal democracy. And the man who noticed this curious corkscrew pattern of history was a man named Francis Fukuyama, an American political scientist, who at the time was a kind of no-name director, deputy director at the State Department, who was little known outside policy circles. And his essay, it published in 1990, I think originally in 1989, but then it became a book in the early 90s, was titled The End of History, and it evoked a great deal of derision. According to Fukuyama, beginning with the French Enlightenment, science and reason had taken hold in human society, which led to ever-increasing superior forms of economic policy, statecraft, and military hardware. Societies that embraced these methods outpaced the societies that did not, and those underdeveloped societies could then futilely resist, or fearing domination, could acquiesce and modernize themselves. And this process Fukuyama called the mechanism. And that meant that mightier societies would dominate weaker ones, and that's what drove history forward. So why, in Fukuyama's eyes, had that process ended with communism's fall, and therefore history itself? Why wouldn't the mechanism just keep playing itself out? So Fukuyama's idea of history having an endpoint meant that, first of all, events were headed in some sort of knowable, identifiable direction, which in 1990, again, meant toward liberal democracy. It was not simply that Soviet Russia unraveled, but all over the world, countries were moving toward a politics of pluralism, markets, and freedom. From fascist Spain to Maoist China, to apartheid South Africa, to the socialist republics of Eastern Europe, to the military juntas in Central America. All of these places were inching toward a kind of liberal society that America had claimed to represent throughout the Cold War. And images of Nelson Mandela in Cape Town and Václav Havel in Prague are replicates, carbon copies of Yeltsin atop a tank in Moscow, rallying his people against anti-authoritarian politics. And the tide of history in the early 1990s seemed to bend unmistakably toward democracy. So the second idea underpinning Fukuyama's theory was that the great ideological debates, the sort of things that led to street violence and campus mayhem in the 1960s and 70s, over debates about what sort of system could guarantee the greatest chance of human flourishing, those debates had ended after the Cold War. That is, every alternative model that claimed it could save humanity throughout the 20th century, fascism, communism, socialism, Maoism, Baathism, Marxism, anarchism, Islamism, even Reformed Catholicism, had proven itself utterly incapable of doing so. Most of these systems, indeed, had resulted in horrific social catastrophes for those involved. The only system that could, however imperfectly, truly activate human potential, according to Fukuyama, was American-style capitalism, what today we would call neoliberalism, i.e. free markets vouchsafed by freely elected politicians with a robust social safety net behind it. So the end of the Cold War for Fukuyama meant the end of debates about whether capitalism was the best form of human organization. The answer was obvious. It was the only. And so, of course, according to Fukuyama, history would still happen. That is, there would still be wars and accidents and troubles and mishaps. But the destination of history was no longer in doubt. All those conflicts in time would be resolved predictably and directionally. So Fukuyama used a very evocative metaphor to illustrate this end of history idea. He compared every country to a caravan heading toward a glorious watering hole, i.e. the paradise of neoliberalism. Some caravans might falter or take the wrong turn or start trouble, but eventually all these caravans would congregate at the watering hole because there was nowhere left to go. And Fukuyama's metaphor of caravans, I think, betrays his conceptual attachment to the United States, as if every country in the world was a kind of 19th century American pioneer or frontiersman. The mighty would still dominate the weak, but the weak, upon becoming mighty themselves, would not then compete with other mighty powers for more mightiness. And Fukuyama here is thinking about the country of origin of his parents, which is Japan. So after the ruins of Japan, after the ruins of post-World I, World War II, Japan is ruined, eventually becomes mighty per Fukuyama's calculus, and is then a peaceful country, right? Doesn't start wars. Democracies, Fukuyama said, don't make wars with one another. Might is right. So if Fukuyama's theory seems somewhat silly to us now, and much of it does, who among us would argue with the basic premise that capitalism has convinced us all of its own inevitability? Maybe the most intractable thing about modern capitalism is how, for all its faults, it drastically erodes the imaginative horizons for what other systems might be possible. For example, during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, thousands of leftists all over the world, including George Orwell, migrated to Barcelona to fight and die on behalf of communism in their struggle against Franco's fascists in Madrid. They risked their lives for a totally different vision of politics and the world. It is, I think, a useful thought experiment to wonder why, as Ukraine wages war with Putin's fascistic Russia, there are no similar brigades of starry international leftists taking up arms on behalf of their Ukrainian comrades, or if there are, there's very few of them. Fukuyama, I think, would say that because the tide of history is known, there's ultimately less at stake in Ukraine than there had been in Spain in the 30s. The outcome of the Russo-Ukrainian war might be tragic and protracted and disorienting, but unlike Spain in the 30s, Fukuyama would contend that the conflict will ultimately not redirect the flow of history. Both Russia and Ukraine, in Fukuyama's vision, are two caravans merely sidetracked, albeit tragically, along the path to the neoliberal watering hole. Ideological politics, for all intents and purposes, are over. So from the ruins of communism in the 1990s, utopian dreamers in America and Europe pictured themselves creating a new society that was different from the world of the past, a just, orderly new world of democracies stripped of the stupid nationalisms and doctrinaire ideologies. They pictured harmonious communities of orderly blocs, a European Union, the EU, the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, NAFTA. And this was a world without borders, on economies that married capitalism's friskiness with socialism's restraint, that mixed entrepreneurship with security, care, and compassion of socialism. To be Western in the wake of the Cold War meant to embrace peace and justice and human dignity. The West, in other words, belonged to the future. It had figured out history's riddles and conundrums and escaped its dogmas. It was a low-key consensus of the not too radical, a utopian vision of those who denied being utopian at all. As Paul Berman, the ever-eloquent historian of the political left, writes, the Europe that had committed suicide in its world wars, the Europe that had laid waste to vast portions of the globe, the Europe that had given rise to one democratic and sinister doctrine after another, the Europe that had clung to its existence only thanks to military invasion and occupation by armies from the United States and its allies, the Europe that was genocidal and monstrous, this Europe did not represent the only possible alternative. It represented the only possible alternative for modern life. A better Europe was already visible, an admirable Europe, a magnificent Europe, a Europe that could claim to be the moral leader of the world. And this was, in short, the world that I, an American born in 1991, entered. My entrance coincided with what the political theorists of the day hailed as the end of history. However unevenly certain societies were marching or being dragged to, it was all towards the watering hole of neoliberal free market capitalism. Yet, as soon as the supposedly post-historical world had taken shape, cracks began appearing all over its surface, most obviously in the Balkans. The disintegration of Yugoslav communism, like its Soviet cousin, resulted in a series of independent states, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Macedonia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. In the latter region, in Bosnia, Bosnian Serbs, supported by the fanatical Serbian government of Slobodan Milosevic, mobilized forces to secure territory against the Bosnian Muslim majority. And a series of conflicts then quickly spread across the region, resulting in horrific episodes of ethnic cleansing. And then, only a few years later, Milosevic's paramilitary forces began to similarly chase Albanians out of Kosovo, which he ferociously believed rightfully belonged to Serbian Christians. Thus, in the very center of the harmonious post-historical Europe of the 1990s, the worst terrors of Nazism, brutal racial politics, nationalistic hysterias, death camps, and mass graves reared their ugly head. There appeared to be new Babin Yars and Auschwitzes popping up every single day. And how should the liberal Western world of the 1990s, dedicated to peace and allergic to militarism, suitably respond? Ironically, through a show of force. European air raids, backed by their pluckier American counterparts through NATO, which in 1995 launched its first ever military operation against Serbian targets, and then again in 1999 against Milosevic himself. And the city of Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, still wears the scars. There were, it turns out, limits to the liberal West tolerance, which refused to tolerate Serbian intolerance. NATO would intervene in tragic situations on behalf of those struggling against tragedy. And this is a point I think worth dwelling on. The post-historical world was also post-pacifist. And what committed leftists, however strong their anti-war convictions, and knowing everything we do about the history of Western imperialism, would argue that Kosovo should have been left to Milosevic's designs. Even two of Western imperialism's biggest critics, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, struggled to explain their critics of NATO in 1999, and each, in the years since, claimed that they were never really all that opposed to stopping the genocide there. The Yugoslav wars confronted the anti-imperial left with a profound dilemma, just as Putin's assault today on Ukraine has. Are there ever forces at work in the world worse than Western intervention? Is Western interloping always and only the biggest threat to world peace? So ironically, deep antipathy toward NATO is the place where Chomsky, a figure of the anti-Western left, and Tucker Carlson, a representative of the isolationist right, meet. So Carlson recently interviewed Putin and took a trip to Moscow, where he visited a grocery store and breathlessly celebrated its holdings. Just as the old Western socialists, the fellow travelers of the Cold War, had gone to places and excused the excesses of Cuba, Russia, North Vietnam, and Cambodia. At a certain point along the ideological continuum, political logic bends back on itself, and leftists, so blinded by the hatred of capitalism, end up, perhaps unwittingly, defending ethno-nationalists like Hugo Chavez and Pol Pot. At bottom of Chomsky's critique and skepticism of the Western industrial military complex lurks an idea that other cultures and countries are not themselves capable of producing their own bad ideas, their own bad actors, and their own human catastrophes. To lay the responsibility of all the world's problems on the West is definitionally a Western-centric view of the world. The challenge for leftists is how to prevent real skepticism about the West from backsliding into all-consuming cynicism. Surely, it would not be controversial to say that Putin's Russia, by any measure, would be worse for the world than the neoliberal United States, and that this claim needs somewhat of a defense betrays how it has fallen under suspicion on corners on both the right and the left. And a useful lesson on this front could be drawn from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who, for all his strong, committed leftist loyalties, denounced and eventually broke with Soviet communism after the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Sartre was, at least on this matter, alert or woke to the potential imbecilities of his own commitments. So, returning to the Balkans, the Yugoslav wars should have made apparent that history was not over. The same bigotries, parochial singularities, cults of violence, and zealous ideologies that had defined the 20th century could in fact reconfigure themselves under and assume new guises in the post-communist world. And while NATO's rockets hailed down on Serbia, Russia stood idly by, helpless to do anything. And this was a geopolitical embarrassment that profoundly outraged wounded nationalists like Vladimir Putin, who in 2005 described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And Putin's remark betrays not a left-wing longing for communism, but a right-wing grievance for the loss of Russia's imperial grandeur. Putin admires Soviet communists not for their leftist inclinations, but for their authoritarianism in the mold of Russia's 18th century czars, like Peter the Great, to whom Putin regularly compares himself. But even as Putin likens himself to Russia's czars of the pre-modern era, we might think of Putin also as a figure of post-history. Putin has explicitly styled himself as a reaction to this end of history idea that took hold in the West. Putin's regime challenges the West's naivete that somehow history had ended after the Soviet Union. Every element of Putin's project, from the jailing of journalists, to the defenestration of businessmen in Athens, to the plutonium-laced breakfast, to the co-optation of the church, to the military adventurism in Moldova, Mali, Syria, and Ukraine, all of it is to show the West what kind of society comes after neoliberalism. Putinism is not post-historical, but post-historical. In his essay, Fukuyama worried that left-wing populism, think Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, that would be what the force that would threaten the neoliberal consensus as a result of economic inequality and working class displacement. What Putin demonstrates, however, is that the chapter that comes after history is fueled by the populist right. Putin brings together kleptocracy, reactionary ethnic politics, fake religious piety, and neo-traditionalist culture values. And worryingly, this kind of political cocktail has also seized the likes of many other countries, including Modi's India, Bolsonaro's Brazil, and Trump's America. Whereas 1989 was a victory for democracy, the 2020s appears to be a triumph for a resurgent cultural rearguard. Is it a coincidence in this light that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has made arrangements just recently with Serbian officials to redevelop Milosevic's bombed fascist headquarters into luxury hotels and shopping malls? That's truly. In the wake of communist internationalism, In post-post history, communist internationalism has been replaced by transnational oligarchy and idiots. And whether or not the Trumps and the Russians actively conspire together, there is a connective tissue between the authoritarian backslide of Russia and the US, along with places like Hungary, Mexico, the Netherlands, Turkey, and the Philippines. Thus, Putin points us in the direction of where Fukuyama's caravans might go after a brief pit stop at the neoliberal watering hole. The future, it turns out, does not belong to neoliberals, but post-liberals. If EU, NAFTA, and NATO are indicative of post-history, Putin's Russia, again, is post-post history. So the full ideological scope of Putinism was made apparent by the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that took place on February 24th, 2022. And I would like to state at the outset, and perhaps somewhat controversially, but I don't see this conflict at all being precipitated by NATO's expansion under George H.W. Bush, as Westerners like both Chomsky and Carlson like to argue. That line of reasoning, I think, is in fact a piece of Putin's propaganda that has sunk its talons into Western discourse. So the NATO argument is a pretext, a Trojan horse for the most insidious forms of Russian nationalism and irredentism. Putin uses NATO to inflame the anti-globalist left and the isolationist right against pro-Ukrainian forces in Western countries. And so why should we take Putin at his word that somehow this is a form of legitimate anti-imperial resistance? Russian aggressors are not the vanguard of the social justice movement. And rarely in world affairs has there in fact been such a case of moral clarity between good and bad, perhaps not since Spain in the 1930s. So contra Fukuyama, history's ideological battles have not been settled in communism's wake. It is therefore telling that Putin uses the language of the French resistance, the language of self-determination and anti-Nazism of the 1940s against Ukraine. Here's an excerpt, and now when he announced the invasion in February 2022. It is necessary to immediately stop this nightmare, the genocide against the millions of people living there who rely on Russia, the leading NATO countries, in order to achieve their own goals, support extreme nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. How is this any different from the French underground trying to denazify their own country in the 1940s? Are these words not just the recycling of the West's own argument that were made on behalf of intervening in the Balkans against Milosevic? With Putin, the liberal rhetoric of Europe, which it learned from the French resistance in the 1940s, has cannibalized itself. The tide of history is like a snake eating itself, and it turns back not to Soviet communism's triumph over Nazism in 1945, but to German fascism's triumph over democracy in 1933. The worst of the old, all of its conspiratorialisms and ancient hatreds become new again and fashionable in post-post history. And the theorist Michael Epstein has described Putin's ideology as a form of schizofascism, that is, fascism disguised as the struggle against fascism. Putin couples post-colonial rhetoric with aggressive colonial practice. He parrots the language of anti-racism and peace, only to negate those ideas over and over again. And evoking the memories of Germany's blockade of Leningrad in the 1940s, one of the worst catastrophes in modern history, Putin has repeatedly ordered the blockading of Ukrainian cities, perhaps as a sadistic, Freudian way to cope with Russia's own unresolved traumas by reenacting them onto another people. Modern Russia is ideologically premised on a theory of total negation. And even today, we are told that the culprits of the recent terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall in Moscow that happened only a few days ago are Islamic fighters from Afghanistan who, aided with intelligence by the CIA, were paid by Ukrainian Jews to foil Russia's plans to denazify Eastern Europe. The logic here is anti-logic. It negates itself at every turn, and that, in a way, is Putin's whole point: to cultivate confusion, to evacuate reality of all meaning. In truth, these attacks were driven by Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war in the 2010s. And Putin now shifts the blame for his own reckless imperial policies in a way that leverages the death of his own civilians to kill more Ukrainians. This is zero gravity politics. It is in this vacuous worldview that takes us, at long last, to Jewish Ukraine. In Putin's ideology of negationism, the real Nazis have been hiding in plain sight. The real Nazis, as it turns out, have been Jewish Ukrainians all along. The threat to civilization is not Russia's neo-imperial aggression, but Ukraine's beleaguered and atomized Jewish communities. The Putinist vision of post-post history is one in which the descendants of Eastern European Jews, the true victims of the Holocaust, are today the engineers of ever newer, even more ominous Holocausts. Maybe, Putin hints, the Jews were to blame all along, Nazis in sheep's clothing. And there are flickers of truth to Putin's irrationalist worldview. Ukraine has indeed dealt with a long history of anti-Semitism. An extreme right-wing organization, such as the revivalist group called the Black Hundreds, wreaked mayhem across post-Soviet Ukraine. And a person who was very pivotal to my own intellectual development, Marina Rajavin at Bryn Mawr College, who's given me permission to use her photograph, fled Odessa in 1994 because of the activity and the rise of anti-Semitism in post-Soviet Ukraine in the early 1990s. So there is a there. However, Ukraine has largely overcome and been able to mollify these tensions. As we all know, the president of Ukraine is Volodymyr Zelensky. He's a Jewish man, and his election should make Ukraine into a case of a genuine, albeit fragile, cosmopolitan society. And indeed, listening to Zelensky, he sounds more European than the Europeans do. Zelensky argues for peace, tolerance, markets, alliances, and self-determination. He endorses a vision of the neoliberal watering hole, clinging to Fukuyama's hope of post-history. Whereas Putin, a figure of post-history, evacuates the West of any promise whatsoever. So how do all of these complex ideas and ideologies, post-history, post-history, neoliberalism, schizofascism, Putinism, end up shaping modern Ukrainian culture? How has this all become so abstract that it has failed to register on the psychology of Ukraine? It is impossible to answer these questions fully, especially with the time that I have remaining, but I'd like to hazard some brief thoughts about two Ukrainian artists, Jewish artists, who tackle these issues. Kira Muratova is one of the most underrated figures, I think, in film history, and also the contemporary poet, Ilya Kaminsky. So we'll start with Muratova. So of Jewish descent, Muratova was a proud Ukrainian filmmaker who released almost all of her films through studios in Odessa throughout the Soviet period, and continued to do so in the post-Soviet period. And to work only through Odessa studios was quite a rarity under the Soviets throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Muratova, throughout her career, was particularly sensitive to issues of bigotry and marginalization, as seen in her first post-Soviet Ukrainian film from 1992 entitled The Sentimental Policeman. So the film begins with an image of a vicious dogfight that wakes up a local neighborhood at night, and everyone pours out to the street to come see the commotion, and they start fighting and yelling at each other to quiet down. Very quickly, however, the squabble backslides, and they start slandering each other, first as fascists, and then calling out the Jews among them. At one point, a man asks, "So is your dog an ugly Jew too?" And through this dogfight, Muratova reveals the ease by even which something as innocent as a neighborhood argument can backslide into parochial and anti-Semitic bigotries and hatred, especially in a place like post-Soviet Ukraine. At one point, a man steps onto his balcony and, crying out at the top of his lungs, recycles all of the insults heard between the neighbors. And I want to show you this clip, but I should say it's not subtitled because it's a very esoteric film. I couldn't find subtitles for it, but I just want you to hear the sonic quality of it. And the word fascist in Russian is fascist. So you'll also be able to pick up that. And I hope this has audio. So that's. Are we good? Better now? Is the IT person still here? There's an echo. Huh? There we go. Yeah. All right. Perfect. Thanks. Sorry about that. I knew the videos. It's always complicated. So in any case, he comes out to his balcony and starts screaming everything that he's heard, all of the insults. And then he starts calling everyone fascist, 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 and then he breaks down on the steps. So in the context of the film, it's unclear whether the man is slandering the dogs and the dog owners as fascists for waking him up, or whether he's slandering his Jewish neighbors as being fascists for caring more about the dogs than the people around them. And I think watching this clip in 2024, as opposed to 1992, it's impossible not to be reminded of Russia's intervention in Ukraine. This is one of the first independently released Ukrainian films after the Soviet Union. And Russia today, as we've discussed, is apparently waging war against Ukraine's Jewish fascists. So Muratova shows here how the incessant repetition of the word fascist throughout the sequence can, in fact, strip it of meaning. Said loudly and unremittingly enough, fascist becomes an empty signifier, plunging political discourse into a kind of free-for-all. And the recurrence of the word fascist throughout the scene triggers a phenomenon that linguists call semantic satiation. And this is what happens when an extended encounter with a word, when it starts to sound like anything at all. It kind of creates a mental fatigue. And semantic satiation oversaturates our perceptual input, weakening the semantic associations between words and their sounds. And so to state the obvious, there is no intrinsic meaning to the word fascist that F-A-S-C-I-S-T would convey. It's just a sound configuration. So it's fitting then that this man breaks down, as we see here, clasping his head in his hands on the steps, as if he's exhausted or frustrated from language's inability to affix meaning to the terms he's constantly hearing. So his exhaustion acknowledges the ease by which words, even words as grave and terrible as fascist, can be manipulated. Muratova shows how the political discourse of isms that has washed over Ukraine has become altogether unintelligible, creating a kind of permanent dissonance, especially for Ukraine's Jewish communities. Elsewhere in The Sentimental Policeman, Muratova impishly deconstructs language. At one point, the main character is seen standing in front of a sign of an orphanage, and the word for orphanage in Russian is the compound phrase dom rebionka, which means literally it's the genitive case house of child, i.e. orphanage. The camera is positioned in such a way, though, where you don't see dom rebionka, you see dom yebionka, which, funnily enough, translates to the house of fucking. So in doing so, in this incident, Muratova impresses on us the carnal, animalistic nature of procreation between children and sex that we sanitize via the language of love, care, and family. In a lewd fashion, Muratova shows us the ease by which language can mislead, surprise, turn against itself, and create openings for all sorts of mischief on behalf of good faith actors and bad faith actors. And this play on swear words in The Sentimental Policeman also acknowledges, and for anyone who knows Muratova, I'd be remiss not to show this, acknowledges the fate of her film Aesthetic Syndrome, which had the distinction of being the last Soviet film banned by censors in 1990, before the collapse of the USSR, because of its foul use of language. And the final sequence of the film consists of an elegantly dressed woman on the Moscow metro, screaming with all her might, fuck your mother, ёб твою мать. And this vulgar language shocked Russian censors, who then shelved the film. And that Muratova puts these words in the mouth of a middle-aged woman, presumably a mother herself, is also not incidental. Muratova here is ingeniously, yet subtly punning on the Russian word for swear word and the Russian word for mother, mat, mat. These words are differentiated in Russian only by a softening of the back T. So through this pun, mat, mat, Muratova is calling attention to the role that mother figures, and in turn, Mother Russia, play in our curse word vocabulary. In the twilight days of Soviet power, Muratova, a proud Jewish Ukrainian who was effectively blacklisted by Soviet authorities, brashly finally had a chance to tell mother fucking Russia to go fuck herself, to get fucked, to fuck off, to shut the fuck up, because life under Russian occupation, then in the 1980s and 90s, and now in the 2020s, is a clusterfuck. And a clusterfuck made so in part by Russia's indiscriminate use of cluster munitions in Ukraine, which has had a horrific toll on civilian life. And for Muratova, a phrase that has not lost meaning because of its oversaturation, which Russian propaganda can't hijack for itself, is fuck you. So finally, just for a moment, I want to turn to the otherwise clean language of Ilya Kaminsky, a contemporary Ukrainian poet who is now residing in the United States. So whereas Muratova amplifies and warps language as a way to deconstruct and critique hegemonic discourse, Kaminsky does so through silence. Kaminsky was born in Odessa in 1977 to a Jewish family, and he emigrated to the United States in 1993. And at the age of 4, Kaminsky suffered a near permanent hearing loss due to complications with the mumps. He was misdiagnosed by a Russian doctor, which I'm sure he hasn't forgotten. Kaminsky, who writes in English, has stated, "The deaf don't believe in silence. Silence is the invention of the hearing." So through his poetry, Kaminsky, like Muratova, challenges the discourse-saturated world of post-Soviet Ukraine. From one poem in a collection of his ingeniously titled Deaf Republic, Kaminsky treats silence as a form of protest. He writes, "Silence, it is a stick I beat you with. I beat you with a stick. Voice beat you until you speak right." This poem portrays silence as an intolerable act in a politically repressive context. Authoritarian leaders like Putin, and for that matter, Stalin, demanded that people spoke up in certain terms, with certain fealties, and in certain words. Yet in this poem, silence represents nonconformity, while language denotes quiescence, inanity, duplicity, oppression. Silence can be seen as a way out of the dominant logics and logistics of power, whereas those caught speaking are to be mistrusted. At other moments, Kaminsky presents silence as a mode of contemplation and self-preservation. And here are a few lines from a poem, Deafness and Insurgency begins. "Our country woke up next morning and refused to hear soldiers. In the name of Petya, we refuse. Our hearing doesn't weaken, but something silent in us strengthens. In the ears of the town, snow falls." So silence here is characterized as a form of escapism and subtle resistance to everyday realities, to make everyday realities tolerable. Silence becomes a way to retreat into one's inner world, an experience that can preserve one's sense of self and the memory of those whose names can no longer be uttered. Kaminsky, I think, is resisting the characterization that has recently taken hold in contemporary political discourse, especially on social media platforms, that silence is a form of violence. The idea of silence as violence implies that those who do not speak out against injustice are complicit in said injustice. And I think Kaminsky is interested in roughening that logic and that assumption. In some contexts, such as parts of Russian-occupied Ukraine, speech carries punishable, even lethal consequences. Not everyone has the privilege or the luxury of call-out culture. Russian aggressors cannot be canceled through words. For ordinary civilians, silence becomes a survival strategy, one of the few left. Their silence, far from violence, is a necessary, last-ditch effort to make politics feasible. So Kaminsky mutes language throughout his poems, whereas in her films, Muratova amplifies and warps it. Equally but oppositely, Kaminsky and Muratova concede the harm that political language has wrought on contemporary Ukraine. So to conclude, what I hope was an altogether dizzying talk, I want to return to the image with which I began, which is an image of Kira Muratova as a centaur, presented as a photograph from one of her other 1990s films. And that is the top half, that is Muratova that's superimposed on the body of a horse. So when we think about Muratova's identity, just as when we think about Kaminsky, like so many other Ukrainian artists working in post-Soviet Ukraine, we result in a series of hyphenated adjectives to capture their identity. Muratova is a post-Soviet, Jewish Ukrainian, Russian, Moldovan, Romanian, poor Ukrainian speaker, and native Russian speaker. To affix her identity to any one of these categories is reductive, yet to account for each of these vectors seems impossible or overwhelming. She uses the image of a centaur, a half-human, half-horse, to capture the messiness of herself and by transitive property, the hybridity and messiness of post-Soviet Ukraine. This image is Muratova's way of saying to all the theorists who try to adumbrate neat, organized ways of thinking about Ukraine, and its Jewish communities therein, that they risk lapsing into a kind of reductive homogeneity. Modern Ukraine is too scrappy, too eclectic, too traumatized, too exciting, too tragic to be encapsulated by existing political frames. The provocation embedded in this startling image is to remove the guardrails from the ways in which we've conceptualized politics, language, ideology, and history previously, and to try to imagine new forms of community and belonging that can better account for Ukraine's heterogeneity. Thank you.
Okay, so should we open the floor?
Please.
Please raise your hand.
Leon.
Yes, so thanks, that was, particularly fascinating. And eloquent. My question is, you've read Fukuyama much more recently than I have, but, and I don't know the article, I only know the book that has The Last Man in the title. And isn't The Last Man, or didn't Fukuyama, my vague recollection is that he sees that the triumph of the liberal democracy as bureaucratic and technocratic and ultimately for cities, and that it's going to, we're going to be bored in that.
Yeah.
And it's going to generate precisely, then he turns to Nietzsche.
Yeah.
It's going to generate these Ubermensch.
Yes.
We then see. So
Yes.
it's all nicely.
Yes.
Am I
Yes, that's exactly the read, right? Is that he says that the end of history turns out to be quite boring. And our goal living in a modern neoliberal society is to come to terms with that boringness, right? To go to talk therapy, figure out the problems of your own life, but sort of ditch the big ideological battles about social political organization, right? So I think for him it's there's a negative valence, that boredom, but I think he's pretty, at least at the time, he sort of changed his tune since. It's still an endorsement, I think, of the neoliberal watering hole. But what's interesting, and I had mentioned this in the beginning part of the talk, he sees the threat coming from the left. He sees the threat, leftist populism. This will shake the foundations of the neoliberal watering hole, right? Bernie Sanders, about working class displacement, technocracy, people feel income inequality, right? The haves, the have-nots. That's where he's worried the force of friction is going to come from. But I think that that's a wrong characterization. I think the 2010s, and especially now in the 2020s, is that the threat to the technocratic, boring, neoliberal watering hole is coming from the right.
Okay, that's a nice clarification. I didn't remember it as being left or right. I remember it as being, we need this return to the great man who will have represent, I don't know, heroism and these great romantic values that the democratic liberalism has sort of silenced.
No, he says that, but my sense is that the anticipation is that again comes from the left. Yeah.
Any other question?
What do you see as the future for the United States and for America? Do you foresee that we are following the same direction as Putin with Trump? Are you not allowed to speak?
No, I can speak. I don't mind speaking. I mean, I feel like so.
They're so the same.
Right. I mean, so someone described sort of Trump, Bolsonaro, the Orban in Hungary, this sort of new cast of characters, right, of the 2010s and early 2020s, as being singularly a part of their nations, right? So Trump is a singular American figure that draws on the history of like the know-nothing party or American isolationism, right? However, they're not unique in a global context. So that if you zoom out, there's all commonalities between them, whether that be traditional values about gender, whether that be a skepticism of free and fair elections, whether that be pushing pressure on the courts to get the things they want, self-enrichment. I mean, all of these people have made massive amounts of money through coming to power, right? So I mean, the United States will have a very, very different trajectory than Russia does. But it seems like there are these kind of political overtones directionally, right? Maybe one is getting there faster than the other, but there does seem to be a current that both are swimming in.
There's one more name, Stephen Miller.
Yeah. I mean, he would.
What is his problem? I mean, mean,
I mean, he's one of these sort of like in this analysis that I set up in this whole talk, he's one of the figures that comes after history, right? That comes after history. And yeah, and sometimes this is coming from the political right in a given country, right? But in a place like Greece, in a place, at least there was a place like Italy, it can be coming from the political left, right? Is that there this kind of strong man style of politics is we're all dancing in different ways to a similar tune, I guess.
I would really like us to go back to the original title of the topic, and maybe you have questions about Ukraine, language, history, literature, poetry, what is happening right now. Yeah.
So going back to the title of the talk, but also trying to put Raymond on the spot, I was interested in this semantic satiety, or I don't know what you call it.
Semantic satiation? Yeah.
And so that it evacuates the repeated word fascism from any meaning, essentially. And I was wondering if we see that if a similar phenomenon isn't happening in the United States with words like anti-Semitism or even racism.
Yeah.
Such that it gets so repeated now that people no longer even care. You don't care if you're called this thing, and so evacuated.
Right.
And I would add
Please.
that and the word Holocaust, because
Yeah.
nowadays we call Holocaust anything and everything, whatever we can find that we need, and that's, yeah.
No, that's a very interesting question. I mean, my hunch is just to say yes. Any word that you have an extended encounter with, right, sort of dilutes the semantic resonance and associations of that word, right? And so constantly being in a media environment. I don't know if you know, it's we're talking about racism too much. I'm not prepared to say that, but I feel like social media, right, and the way by which we can amplify speech and talk to each other, we are encountering this more and more and more, right? I think what's interesting about the word fascism is that fascism really in the post-war period in the United States isn't the term that gets bandied around like it does in Europe, right? In the American context, there's not a history of us calling fascist, like right-wing politicians fascist until quite recently, right? And I think that that's also this way by which, to Joe's question, by which there's this resonance or concurrence with what's happening in the United States with the rest of the world, because we've inherited this sort of European political language of fascist, Nazi, genocide, totalitarian, right? That's not American vocabulary. It's not in our kind of political trajectory, but I constantly hear the word fascist in American circles right now, right? I mean, I think the Atlantic Time and the New Republic have had recent cover stories about American fascism, right? And so on one hand, it can be describing an apt situation that is happening, but it also, I think, is also just reflective of the term's dilution, is that it's been diluted to such a point where it gets used to describe so much that it's even crossed the Atlantic and is now being used everywhere here, even if there's some utility in it. So that, I know I sort of dodged the larger question about racism.
But this is exactly, if I may add
Yeah.
to that, this is exactly what was happening in Russia after the post-war years, because the word fascist, as well as the word Jew,
Yes.
became simply a curse word, you know, and this is what you live with. You can call, I can tell you the story from my son's elementary school, when one Jewish kid called another Jewish kid, well, pardon my French, kak, you know, because that was a curse word. That was not the nationality that she had in mind, you know. It was simply, it lost the meaning of national belonging, although it was the fifth paragraph in your passport. So the word, yeah, and that was obvious. The moment you show your passport, everybody knows who you are.
Right.
And in schools, on the class journal, on the back of the class journal, every nationality was recorded. So if one curious kid would take the class journal to the teacher's room, so she could definitely know who the kids in the class are, using it as derogatory terms or derogatory situations, and or anything they wanted it to be used for. But those words, they lost their meaning. Fascist is just the enemy associated with World War II.
Right.
And what I find terribly horrific, what is happening right now, that is the language of the lowest level of population. And that is slowly moving from a curse word into acquiring more and more meaning with this national hatred, with the permission of torture. I mean, if any of you follow the news and you have seen those 4 Tajik men, we still don't know if they were real terrorists or they were not. But anyway, the way they were beaten up, it was shown on the TV. And the reaction of the people in their houses watching this TV was, they deserve it.
A more disgusting expression that is common now, and it's been common for several years, if you don't want to say the K word, is did you Jew him down?
Oh, yeah.
To Jew someone down.
Yeah, to do someone down.
You know, it just loses its meaning about Judaism. Did you Jew him down? You know, and but then everyone knows Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. So.
You know, my husband and I, we came to, who is also present here, and we came to this country in 1988. And we lived in a university community in the university town in Bloomington, Normal, Illinois. And they had a very exclusive gourmet club. And one time they were serving Russian dishes, and they decided that they're going to serve the Russians as well. So we were invited to this gourmet club, and I had a nice conversation with the person who was sitting next to me, and then she turned around and said, I couldn't believe that someone can learn English with such a Jewish accent.
Sheila has a question, and this is also, I feel.
Sorry.
No. I would like to hear your thoughts about this too. So Sheila asks, I wonder if you can speak a little more about traditional Jewish communities in Ukraine and how, within your analysis, they're actually object of the war discursively. So I again, this is off my area of specialty, but I think just something that immediately comes to mind is that the war is recreating the experiences of displacement, of blockades, of camps, of deportations, that defined World War II, right? So this experience of Putin's campaign is to reinvigorate and to re-enliven the memories of the anti-fascist campaign for Russia, but then also of the Holocaust and anti-Semitic violence in Ukraine.
But, you know, I am a specialist in children's literature, and one of the topics that I'm writing about and researching is Holocaust in children's literature in the 21st century. I am part of an international project. So, and I can tell you that the word Holocaust doesn't mean anything for the Russian kids nowadays. A very famous story about two twin sisters who participated in one of the TV shows, and they were like terribly gendered, so boys against girls. And the boys were asking questions, and the boys asked two of the sisters, they asked them, well, what is Holocaust? And one sister said, I don't know. And the other one said, Holocaust, chloroform, okay, it's a glue for the wallpaper. And when the history teacher was asked, so how come? She said, we're talking about World War II. In our textbooks, we're talking about World War II. So, and World War II, which in Russian context is Great Patriotic War. So even different Victory Day, because you celebrate here May 8th, so we celebrate over there May 9th, which is, by the way, my son's birthday. So it was my personal victory. But anyway, this is very complicated, talking about the language and talking about how do you identify through the language the Russian community versus Ukrainian community. I think the school, in a way, erases this meaning. What I would like to say that after the 1990s, it was the Jewish community in Ukraine was a very multilingual community. They spoke Russian, they spoke Ukrainian.
Yiddish.
Well, Yiddish started to die out. Well, it was a revival in 1960s, yeah, Polish, by the way. I mean, Western Ukraine was speaking Polish. So, and linguistically, it was really very diverse community. And it stopped nowadays. Even people who speak Ukrainian very badly decided to switch to it totally and not speak Russian anymore.
Could we come back once more to Chomsky?
Sure.
I first discovered that he was sort of pro-Pol Pot.
Yeah.
About 20 years ago, and
Yeah.
it blew me away. I'm not surprised that he's finding reason to keep the US from doing anything as far as Ukraine is concerned, but could you elaborate a little
Sure,
bit
yeah.
more on,
So
comes to these positions?
I got into studying Russia, in fact, by like getting into like leftist political history, right? And so Chomsky was a big figure of somebody who I was in high school, you know, like discovered Noam Chomsky and felt edgy and countercultural, and there was a lot to learn. And he begins with these very, very real critiques of the United States, particularly post-Watergate, right? Particularly with the idea that there's secrets being kept, right? And the infiltration of the CIA and the civil rights movement. This is when Chomsky really he starts writing about what we're doing in Indonesia, the illegal bombings of Cambodia, the intervention in Laos, right? And so there's a lot to like about Chomsky, right? It's kind of like a muckraker, right? But I think it becomes so intense and zealous in a way, right? That he ends up any person, any regime, any group that strikes itself as being anti-Western imperialism, anti-American, therefore has something to it. Even if it's somehow excessive, even if it's a little curious, even if it's a little unsavory, the most important thing is their anti-American credentials, right? And that's the same logic that gets people to defending characters like Pol Pot. It's the same thing that I encounter among young people on the left who defend Assad in Syria, right? Is that maybe there's excesses here, but at least it's a kind of jackal on the back of the Western military industrial complex. And the big imaginative failure, I feel like, of leftist thought is a complete failure to grapple with other forms of non-Western imperialism. Right, so like I think often of the Iran-Iraq war, right? The West is not involved, right? But that war is begun through very, very organic, long-standing historical doctrinal differences between Iranians and Iraqis, right? And it's a completely vicious, horrible war in the right? And I don't know how Chomsky helps us think about that. Right? How does he think about the death camp? How does he help us think about the death camps in Cambodia? I don't think he does. I think he's actually counterproductive. He's never mentioned it. He's never mentioned it because it would resist the logic of the West is the number one evil, right? And I'm not an apologist for the West. I'm not a neocon, right? Yeah. At all. But I also think Chomsky, like socialists in the 1930s, were blind to their own commitments and excused a lot.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a distinction in either Ukraine and Russian and the word Holocaust and show.
Say it again, please.
Is there a separate word like you have it in English and it's coming back in 330s for Holocaust and show?
Yeah, it is catastrophe.
Cool.
Yeah, catastrophe. Yeah. So, but still very little. And from my experience in children's literature, what was very interesting that a lot of translated literature came over because they were private publishing houses, and they started to translate Swedish, Danish, German stories about the Holocaust. So, I mean, suddenly that was the topic that children were reading about. So, and that was a stimulus to start to talk about national tragedies in Russia, like Stalinism, Gulag, for children and young adults. But they are two separate words, but both don't have any solid base for that. So, within the culture. You were talking about Yiddish, right? You were asking about Yiddish?
I just meant you were mentioning different languages.
Yeah, language.
You want an anecdote?
He has good ones.
Okay, 1923, my grandmother and my father, my uncles, two uncles, 3, 6, and 9. My father was 9. They left on the good ship Estonia from Danzig.
Oh.
They had made good their travels from Uman in Ukraine. My grandfather had a farm. He was also in the army, so he had military roots, but he was in the army. He also raised horses. Tarkovsky.
It's your middle name.
Bolsheviks or someone of those that ilk came to their farm and wanted horses. He said no, and that was the end of him. They tied him to a horse, ran him around the field, and at the end of the day, the neighbors had brought him in to the house, and he was in bed, and my uncles and my father, little kids, got into bed with him, and then he died. They left. My grandmother left that community, migrated to Romania, and from Romania went to Poland, Germany, whatever, and got out. All from Ukraine. And so I have bad feelings. And they came to, of course, New Jersey. And I don't know whether it was much better. They came to New Jersey, started life, and it's a hell of a time to hear what's going on in the Ukraine now with Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, it is terrible, and nobody knows when it will stop and what will come after it. You know, yeah, go ahead.
Great presentation, very thought-provoking.
Thank you, Mason.
But you presented us with a linguistic problem that I think most of us have probably encountered before in discussion, but I was just curious if you might have any thoughts as a path forward for students, academics in Ukraine with pointing out maybe something like fascism when you yourself are labeled as fascist.
Right. I resort to history, right? I mean, fascism has a long history, right? It's coined by Mussolini in the 1920s, who also coins totalitarianism, right? That's a Mussolini coinage. And so I think I was an undergraduate student of history, and I feel like I still am a closet historian, even though I do film and culture stuff. I feel like I'm still ultimately a historian. And so I feel like not taking things as they are, sort of thinking about it like a word is like a cellar, and it can be opened up and then sort of doing kind of archaeology through it. I think that can be very clarifying, in fact. I don't know if that...
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
I just was curious.
Yeah.
If you thought that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big movement in Russian studies and Slavic studies to decolonize, right? And that's also like, that's a word that I hear so much that I don't even know what it means anymore. So I'm like satiated by decolonization, just like I'm satiated by fascism. And that's not fascism at all. I mean, it's a good, noble impulse to do it. I think sometimes it can be, it's not always obvious how it's done. But I think when I think about Russia now, I think about Russia the way I imagine somebody who studies Jane Austen thinks about the British Empire, right? Is that Russia is the Soviet Union is ultimately a colonial experiment, right? Russia kind of reanimates its 19th century empire, and that all Soviet cultural production, political ideologies, writing can't be thought of apart from this colonial enterprise, right? It's kind of the Russification that gets tied up with socialism in the 20th century, right? And I know that's not a super specific example, but I feel like that's kind of my point of departure.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to ask a question
Go ahead.
about the degradation of language. So this is a theme that you brought up in several different forms, right? We have semantic satiation, the sort of overuse of words that lose their meaning. We talked about how Ukraine used to be a multilingual community that is moving toward a monolingual community because of the violence that's happening. You mentioned that in Russia, right, there's this conflict between like silence is violence versus silence is protective, right? I'm thinking about in particular about the like одиночный пикет, right? So like you have like the one person picketing that was allowed for a while. And someone came out at the start of the war with like 8 asterisks, so 3 and then 5 that stood in for нет войне, right? No to war, but they can't say it. So,
Right.
and they were still
That's great.
detained.
Yeah,
Right,
right.
so there's this degradation of the erasure of language. Now, here's my, okay, I'm gonna do one more thing with the centaur.
Go ahead.
And I'm gonna ask you to talk about.
Okay.
It's really a question about the threat of AI, artificial intelligence. And I have lots of concerns about the threat of AI and degradation of language over
Yeah.
time. So my question really is about like linking post-truth and post history in terms of degradation of language. I'm gonna say one more thing about the centaur. So the centaur photo, this is a photo embedded in a film, and it's a manipulated photo.
Yes.
It's both, so I'm thinking about like the beginning of post-truth. So it's actually Kira Murata.
It is, yes.
Her head.
Uh-huh.
And it's pictured as the photograph as if it could exist, but
Right.
it can't exist
Right.
because the centaur is a mythological
Right.
creature. Yet it's her, but it's not
Right,
her.
right.
So these
Mm.
layers
Mhm,
of
mhm,
truth and manipulation of images.
mhm.
So now we have
Mm.
AI that's manipulating video, film,
Mhm.
right? You can make anybody do anything. And we have this like, right, this non-human sort of system
Mhm.
of large language models that is,
Mhm,
it's cannibalizing
mhm,
language
mhm,
and falsifying information
mhm,
and
mhm.
distributing it
Mhm.
in massive quantities. So I feel like there's a link
Yeah.
between the idea of post history and
Yeah.
post-truth.
There
world.
is. Yeah.
And
Great.
the centaur also is a figure that Ethan Mollick, who's one of these educators who works on AI, who blogs about it, he talks about how workers of the future are going to either become cyborgs where they kind of integrate the human brain and the AI happening at once, or centaurs that move between human function, where humans are good, and then where the AI is good. Kind of become this.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about AI as a threat, further threat to the degradation of language, and any links you can see between
Sure.
post-truth and post-book?
Sure. So Molly also wrote a book about photography, which makes sense to talk about. I mean, I'm extremely pessimistic about AI, not because I think this is, going to precipitate like the end of humankind. It's not going to be the Matrix. That's not why I'm like pessimistic about it. I'm pessimistic about it because those with power, with existing power, will be the ones who get to use it the most and the most effectively and the most sinisterly, right? Is that this is not going to become, I don't really imagine AI becoming kind of a tool of the protest movement or of the counterculture, right? It's going to be a regime-based tool that floods all sorts of airways, right? And virtual channels with more and more and more misinformation, right? And so I think whether it be post-history, post-truth, all of these are all birds that fly together to me. Is that it's somehow it's not coincidental to me that we're seeing the kind of like zero gravity Putinist politics where they're funded by the Islamic terrorists are funded by the United States and they're going to return to their Jewish overlords in Ukraine so that they can resist the denazification. I mean, it makes no sense, right? I mean, it's something that like a bad AI generator would produce, right? And so, right, and I feel like this is all what AI is. This is the gift that AI is going to give us, right? It's going to be more of this have truth and method. And the point of it is not, nobody really believes, even the most ardent Putinist ideologue like Prilepin doesn't believe that these are, CIA-backed terrorists going back. The whole point is just to get everybody to be like, I don't know what's true. It's too complicated. There's too many competing narratives. There's too many terms I don't understand. Who knows, right? So, I mean, it just is about enrooting conspiratorialism, right? And then nothing can possibly be true. And that's, I think, also a feature of post history. I think maybe that dystopian note.
Yeah, thank you so much for
Thank you,
coming.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.